If you can do all your stuff, what can figure it out? That's how it chooses you.
Yeah, I've had a great week off so far.
Yeah?
Yeah, for the most part.
What you been doing?
For the first 4 days, I drank and smoked a bunch of weed. I only had a couple beers, but was high most of the day. All day long. And that was really lovely, and 4 days of that was enough. And then I was like, okay, next. My friend Carla and I are doing a summer workout challenge thing. I was like, I need to move my body. Will you be my accountability buddy? And she's like, yeah, sure. So we text each other like, I did it. Okay. So that's been fun. It's actually been terrible, but it's a new thing as opposed to the same old things that are problems. So like, I feel like changing the problem is somehow progress, I think.
Totally.
Yeah. And the problem now is that I used to be able to do this stuff. Like, I was a physically active child, and I've been an office worker for 12 years. So, yeah, the body requires some attention for sure.
I'm excited to hear that Operation Get Hot lives.
Mm-hmm. It does. The food thing is still, I'm happy about it. But the reason I say that with hesitation is because, like, acupuncture has removed my emotional need for food, but it also kind of just turned it into fuel. And it's not really a place where I experience a lot of enjoyment anymore. And I used to, even if it was like, emotionally bankrupt enjoyment, before, if it was like desperate, sad enjoyment before, at least I had some enjoyment, right? So I mean, like, I'm doing all these things that are on paper making me healthier, but what I'm experiencing is just like, I'm just cutting out the things that give me joy.
Right.
So I'm really looking forward to developing the ability to experience joy in ways that are actually good for the organism, you know?
Yeah.
But apparently that's a process and doesn't happen immediately, which is bullshit. But here we are. Yeah. So the moving, I was like, oh, I can totally, no, I can't do that. Oh no. And she's this tiny little Asian woman, and she's stunningly beautiful. And like, she's obviously worked on her body. Like, I don't need her to be a rocket scientist and hot. Like, I need her for the hot part, you know?
Right.
So, you know, she is who she is. But I mean, her body is beautiful. And so I'm like, okay, well, I don't really want her body though. Like, what I want is to be able to be a superhero myself. Like, I don't want to be super muscular like MMA fighter, but it would be great if I could win a fight. That's all. You know. So
how are you going to test this out?
Well, it'll take a while. I mean, baby steps. We're in early days, you know. But I'm going to test it by fighting a Nazi. That'll be like my graduation from training. Instead of killing the puppy that has accompanied me, I'll actually just go kill a Nazi. That'll be my thing. Yeah. How are we talking about killing Nazis? Oh, that's the other thing I've been doing. That's why I'm talking about killing Nazis. I've been watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of TV that needs to be watched, and that's definitely... I missed it somehow. I just couldn't... I don't have TV, you know, so I can't watch it until it's on Netflix anyway. And 2 years ago or something, I watched the first season and was so upset by the fact that Ward turned out to be Hydra that I couldn't keep watching it. I was like, this is terrible. I hate this. I never want to watch this again. This is too much emotionally. And it didn't help that I was working with Alexis at the time. And so I would watch an episode or two, and I would come in and I would just be like lost and haunted. And she'd be like, do you need to talk about it? So like, we stole several hours from our employer just like processing what was happening on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Which I'm totally okay with, you know, ultimately. But that's just me and my fuck the bosses mentality, which has apparently led me to being in a master's program in my mid-40s. I don't know. I'm just questioning all of my life choices right now. I've got 2 more weeks off, and I'm like, what can I do in 2 weeks to sort this shit out, man? Whew. Yeah.
Well, what I want to know is what happens when your mentality is fuck the bosses and you're the boss.
Oh, it's different because I'm the boss.
Right.
And hopefully, like, the things I hate about bosses will not be behaviors I then engage in when I am one. You know, like, I'd like to think that my classism and my awareness of classism, rather. I am classist. I'm just classist, like, in favor of the lower classes. I would like to think that awareness would translate even when I have power. That's the goal, right? Is like you amass power to yourself, but then you don't turn into Daenerys Targaryen, who has the power and then just burns people alive because she's mad. Like, you would hope that you would make better choices than that.
Right.
But I did just turn it from I to you, like distancing the idea from me personally. So maybe I do want to burn people alive. Maybe that's why I'm doing it. That remains to be seen. You live so far away, though. I won't burn you alive. Don't worry. Also, you're not a Nazi, and really, like, my anger is directed in that way specifically. Yeah, so that's been my week, and also this story, which is a bummer. This story is a bummer. Oh God. Yeah, and really challenging because it's a huge event that affected millions of people. Well, probably not millions at the time. Hundreds of thousands, I would say. Yeah, so researching that. How's your week been? What you been doing?
Oh, man, it's all about the tomatoes.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we're getting our first...
shit, Claire, I'm sorry. This is It Chooses You.
Yep, I'm Claire Patton.
I'm Teresa Sparks. This is a podcast where we talk about things we love. And the conceit is that stories choose us. We had never really said that. Yes, the conceit of this podcast is that stories float around and they pick a person. And the person becomes obsessed with them. And then the person must tell other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I love tomatoes.
And Claire loves tomatoes. And I want to punch Nazis.
We're just getting a significant harvest from our garden of tomatoes. So
Yay.
It's been all about the freaking tomato sandwiches.
Yes, the best part of late summer.
Oh my
The best
God.
part. Little mayo on there.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Salt, pepper. That's it, you know.
Perfect.
And the thing is, I should explain because I forget that we're unique in this way. We don't buy tomatoes at the store.
Yeah, no.
Because they taste like desperation.
Cardboard. Yes.
Yeah.
That's better. That's so much better. They taste like desperation. Yeah, that's true.
So this is our reward for not buying store-bought tomatoes. Mm-hmm. And of course we'll buy them at the farmer's market if we're there or something like that. That's not really happening for us right now in the COVID times.
Yeah.
The Rona era.
The Rona era. That's right. Rona is a good nickname for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, COVID is fine. It's fine. But
Rona has personality.
It does. It does. She's in her 50s. She's used to being in control. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She'll fuck you up just because she feels like it.
Yep.
And then you think she's gone, and she's like, nope, still here fucking up your lungs and brain. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we've been eating tomatoes, and it's been great.
Yeah.
And we will do that for a month, and then not again for another year.
Yeah.
So.
That's the hard part, is they're so good. They're so good.
It's our first year here on this land with this garden, so it's been kind of rough, but I will say I have never grown tomatoes like this. And I'm sure part of it is the conditions of this year are probably more well suited toward tomatoes, but we've never grown massive happy plants as we are now. So I do want to just say that because it can be easy to get discouraged.
Yes, revel in the success. That's right. Mm-hmm. Roll around in it. Dab it behind your ears.
That's right.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I was going to say, my parents are, I'm from farming people. And so all the tomatoes I ate in the fall and winter were tomatoes that my family canned in the summer. And so they were just as
Those
good.
Those are so good, too.
Just as good.
So
Blanch them, peel them, can them, have them in February. Oh, God. So like every chili I had as a child was amazing.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm sorry, Texans. We put tomatoes in chili in West Virginia. Our bad.
I'm Texan and I put tomatoes in my chili.
Oh,
I know
okay.
that it's against the rules, but
okay. Yeah,
I think beans are controversial too. But
okay.
I'm down for whatever. I ate chili made by a French woman once, and it was delicious. It had like fucking carrots in it. I was like, whatever, this is great.
It's tasty, whatever.
Yeah.
Isn't that, yes, this is not a place where the chili orthodoxy thrives, okay?
That's right.
We're open-minded here. Okay. Yeah, so amazing.
I didn't realize your family was gardeners. I didn't know that they...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My mother is an only child, but my maternal grandmother has 8 brothers and sisters. And all of them survived World War II, which was amazing because all the boys fought, except the youngest. And when they came back to Southeast Ohio, they gardened. My great uncle Henry was a dairy farmer. My uncle Victor was a drunk and a farmer. Mm-hmm. My uncle Norman was a school teacher and a farmer. You know,
wow.
Yeah, farming people for sure. And then my dad didn't have farmers in his. I think so. My dad was born in England. This is a lot about trees, a family tree. My dad was born in England, and my English family are not farmers because there's no land there. You know, like you can't get it. I think. Yeah, so my dad doesn't have farmers in his family, but he turned our backyard into a small farm when my sister and I left for college. Yeah, he was out there like Farmer Al. Like I actually have a photo of him leaning on a shovel in his 60s. That's pretty amazing.
I have a small related anecdote. A couple of years ago grew my first cucumber, and I ate it. And it was so delicious. And I was like, oh, I remember my grandfather growing cucumbers. And I remember having one out of his garden. But that was a memory from like 30 years before. And I was like, holy shit. Now I remember. I think we do hold those memories in our body.
Yeah, I mean, there's something like plant magic is not only like herbs or flowers or whatever. Like, there's please science look into this, because when you eat something that you have grown, it is a different experience. It's much richer, much more magical, and it feels like you don't need as much food when you're the one growing. It's true. It, you know,
it's true. I think it's because it's spiritually nourishing in addition to it probably more nutrient dense. But I think that knowing the story of what you eat. I think that we are story seekers as human beings. So knowing the story of what you've eaten nourishes you on a more spiritual level. Mm-hmm. As a chronic overeater my entire life, I feel, and I am an expert on this topic.
Amen. The Church of Overeating. Yeah, so I'm really proud of you. After we record, I would like you to take your phone out and show me your plants. Because I crave a vision of your garden. Yeah. For sure. I only saw it, I think, 4 months ago. Yeah. When it just looked like a lot of hard work and tiny plants.
It still looks like that, but there is some satisfaction, a little bit. The tomatoes and the cabbages are incredible.
That's awesome.
Everything else is exhausted.
Brassicas are like, I got you. Mm-hmm. Don't you worry. What else do you need? Yeah, brassicas are tough-ass motherfuckers, man. Brassicas, brass knuckles. Yeah, that's right. That's how they roll.
That's the etymology.
That is, yeah. Brassica, I think, comes from the Latin for brass knuckles. Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to tell you about the children's blizzard today. But more specifically, I'm going to report to you David Laskin's version of the children's blizzard. David Laskin is a historian and a writer who wrote a book called The Children's Blizzard. And let's see, he's the author of Partisans, Marriage, Politics, and Betrayal Among the New York Intellectuals, and Braving the Elements, The Stormy History of American Weather.
Also famous for the great Dairy Queen blizzard research.
That's right. He's currently working on a history of Dairy Queen blizzards. I don't have any jokes about Dairy Queen because I can't remember what any of the shit is called. Oh, there's a chapter on peanut butter parfaits. It's not a joke. It's just...
That was good. That was good.
Oh, thank you. This is very kind of you. Supportive. Anyway, so this book is the source for what I'm about to, for the story I'm about to tell you, and a lot of the language in here is his. So this is basically David Laskin's Children's Blizzard.
Right.
Yeah.
Before you start, can I tell you, I've never heard of the Children's Blizzard.
Oh, yeah.
When you texted this topic to me the other day, 2 wild ideas popped into my head. The first was a blizzard that somehow only affected children. Mm-hmm. All the adults were fine, and the children were like, look at the snow! I'm freezing! The second, I feel like as soon as you start the story, I'm going to sound like an asshole. But that's okay. The other idea that occurred to me was a blizzard in which instead of snowflakes, there were teeny tiny children flying around.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's strangely enough, you've got it. Out of nowhere, you totally nailed the topic of it. That's so
Isn't
great.
the human imagination spectacular?
It really is. Please cut out that braying laugh I just did. I saw how much it spiked on the thing. You're definitely going to want to cut it out. That's going to hurt people if they hear it. But don't cut out me telling you to cut it out.
Okay.
All right. Oh, God. Yeah, so, okay.
Is this a hard turn?
It's a hard turn, but please interrupt me. Like, I know this story really well. The magic of this story is the magic of the best stories I bring to you, which is that I find them on my own. Like, sometimes I'm deliberately searching for a story to tell, and that's fine. And I find some good things, and I like talking about it, and I don't ever talk about something I'm not interested in, and that's all good. But a couple of them are things that I've found, like, in like a pristine way, where I was just wandering the library and I was like, what's that book? You know? Mm-hmm. And this is one of them. Like, I literally was like, what's that about? Oh my God! You know? And so lots of people have talked about it, lots of media outlets and whatever. Like, it's in there. People have discovered it and told the story before. But I didn't find it from them. I found it from the universe handing me this story. So it's
in the real world.
In the real world.
That's you had to walk up to a shelf.
I went into a building and I touched things to find this story. That's right. I could have bumped into something when I found this story. That's how real it is. Yeah. Okay. So America, before and during most of its colonization by white Europeans, was tall grass prairie from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from Canada to Texas, interrupted only by streams and rivers and later wagon roads. The Midwest is a 1,000-mile expanse that is 1,000 miles from either ocean. And because large bodies of water regulate weather on land, the further removed the land is from the sea, the more variable the weather is. And the greater the extremes of temperature and moisture, and the faster the weather can change. So we know that's true because if you look at, like, if you, for example, get on the National Oceanographic and era, whatever, the NOAA station that's here in Boulder, they have data from Mongolia, and Mongolia is actually the most landlocked place. Like, Central Asia is the most land place, like the furthest from the sea. And that's why, like, the Gobi Desert is there. It gets really intense when you're far from water. The thing, I love this book very much. I love David Laskin. Thank you very much for writing this book. It's an amazing piece of research. He does not at all address the fact that everything we're about to say is due to white Europeans' genocide of the native peoples of this land. He mentions Native Americans maybe 3 times in the whole book. It's just not a lens through which he's viewing it. And, you know, I don't know when it was published. It was not recent. That's not an excuse, but I'm going to throw in more of that than he did because I think we need to. So, in 1862, the Homestead Act declared that any adult citizen or intended citizen, right? This is it's a request for immigrants as well as a gift to people right, in quotes, to people who already live here. Any citizen or any intended citizen could claim 160 acres of government surveyed land, mostly in what's now North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. They could have it free and clear in exchange for an $18 filing fee and 5 years of residency and farming of it. Like, can you imagine?
Right.
Can you imagine? Now, I don't know the exchange rate for $18. It's probably more substantial, right? But still, for 160 acres? Oh my God. Okay. So in the 3 decades after 1870, more than 220 million acres of land were plowed, stripped of sod, and planted with row crops. That's more land than had been, quote, improved in the previous 263 years of white colonization of this land. While electric lights beamed out from skyscrapers in Chicago, homesteaders in Dakota built houses out of sod and fires out of buffalo bones. And because these white people were new to the ecosystem, they had no idea how to work with the land. No sense of the rhythms of the seasons, no eye out for the dangers known to native people, whose genocide at the hand of white Europeans was at this point very far advanced. Their unfamiliarity left them vulnerable and exposed. Children waded into tall grass and vanished. Infants were accidentally dropped into snowdrifts and lost. And infection was rampant.
Christ.
Right? Can you imagine? It's like a hellscape. And infection was rampant because they lived in tiny, cramped, horrible dirt houses, right? The telegraph existed, but homesteaders, for the most part, didn't live near enough to telegraph offices for any urgent messages to make it to them in time. And because of the way the Homestead Act was written, it wasn't possible for people to build towns and have their plots of land radiate out from a center. It was one family on 160 acres, and the next family was 160 acres over. Now, an acre is about 43,000 square feet, or about 200 by 200 feet, a little more than that. And so 160, 200-foot segments it's a substantial plot of land. Like, you're not close to your neighbors. And of course, the children of these families were the extra workers that could make the difference between survival and starvation. And so they worked on the farm as soon as, doing whatever they were capable of for their age. And they mostly attended school in the autumn and winter when there was less to do on the farm. How you doing so far? You with me?
Good, yeah.
Okay.
We're on 80 acres, so I'm just imagining 2 of what we have between us and our neighbors. That's a lot. It's a lot of land.
Have you guys looked into whether or not your plot was originally surveyed for the Homestead Act?
No.
It probably, I bet it has a historical plot number. I bet you're on half a plot.
That's probably true.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
I know it's been in the same family since the 1800s, so.
Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, we should look it up.
Yeah. We'll do that later. That'll be a follow-up story next year. The history of Claire's plot of land. Okay, so in the 1870s and 1880s, there were several really bad winters. And if they were particularly bad, they got a name, which I love. Like the snow winter of 1880 and 1881, which Laura Ingalls Wilder chronicled in her book, The Long Winter. It saw snow so deep that it covered the door opening of houses as early as October 15th.
Oh, Jesus.
Right? It came so early that many families left grain, potatoes, and other crops in the field, not having harvested them in time and believing that the first snow would melt and allow them to harvest before, quote, real winter set in. Oh, these poor bastards. And they hadn't stockpiled enough fuel to keep them warm either. Because they're living in sod houses, they're burning buffalo bones and straw. Like, there are no trees on the prairie, right? But the snows never stopped coming that year, and by Christmas, many families were close to starvation. One group of families took turns cutting tracks in the snow, swapping out teams of horses about every half mile to keep the animals fresh, trying to take the wheat they had harvested, which was only a portion of their crop, to the closest flour mill and back. A 40-mile round trip. Can you imagine a 40-mile round trip when your horses are tired after half a mile? Like, oh, God. Okay. I mean, it kind of, in a certain way, it's like, well, shit, how bad was it where they came from? Like, this was somehow preferable, you know? Jesus.
Right.
So, my friend Jason, so we're going to talk a lot about winter and cold and wind in this story. My friend Jason used to say that the difference between a snowstorm and a blizzard is that when you're in a snowstorm, you think, oh my God, look at this blizzard. And when you're in a blizzard, you think, oh my God, we're going to die.
Right.
Like, that's the difference. So the winter of blue snow, which was 1886 to 1887, saw temperatures dip so low for so long that in January of 1887, after a fierce 72-hour snowstorm, millions of cattle were left dead and dying on the plains, having bled to death when their legs were sliced open by the ice crust, or been suffocated when the ice crystals plugged their nostrils, or collapsed from exhaustion. Some herds were never found. Some were found heaped in riverbeds and streams like it says like slap on my paper here. I'm pretty sure I meant like slag, but that's fine.
I thought you were going to say like slushies. Blood slushy.
Yeah. Ew, it's so gross. Awesome. Their bodies were so frostbitten that only their hides could be salvaged. And that's salvaged, not savaged. let me just fucking try that again. Let me just try all that again. Some herds were never found, and some were found heaped in riverbeds or streams like slag. Their bodies were so frostbitten that only their hides could be salvaged. Then when spring finally came, flooding streams and rivers were choked with dead animals.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Contemporary reports say that winter killed 12 million cattle. 12 million cattle. Can you imagine? But also, think of the biomass of grass required to feed that many cattle. Like, what a fertile place this is, right? Like, that's just, I mean, it's an indicator of fertility and also just hugely a bummer. Okay, so the winter of 1887 to 88 started with 2 months of zero weather, in quotes, as one schoolboy put it. And the coldest weather came in December and January. Just before the new year, a pool of Arctic air settled over the upper Midwest. And on December 29th, the Minnesota State Weather Observer recorded a temperature of 46 below. Observers at 2 other stations in this area weren't able to take temperature readings because the mercury in the thermometers had frozen solid.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Fuck that.
Fuck that. So this winter, 1887 to 88, the children's blizzard happened on Thursday, January 12th, 1888. So this is the winter we're talking about when we talk about this blizzard. It's hard to imagine weather this cold. When you step outside into 46 below air, the air hits you like a slap. Like it literally knocks you, right? After a breath or two, ice builds up on the hairs of your nose, and the film on your eyeballs starts to freeze. A dozen paces from the door, your throat begins to feel raw, your lips dry and crack, and tears sting and freeze at the corners of your eyes. I think of every space movie I've ever seen where they eject someone from an airlock and they like float off into space, you know, frozen solid. It's like that, except you're just stepping out your door. And the air is just like, oh, we're in space. I didn't know, you know. A run of record-breaking cold, like 20 below zero at dawn in some places, started on the 8th of January, 1888, and continued with only 1 day of reprieve until the 22nd. It was time to hunker down in your one-room sod house under blankets and clutch your family for warmth. But the morning of January 12th, 1888, was stunningly beautiful. People said the air had a mysterious velvety quality, and that the sky was the color of copper. One boy, who was the first out of his house that morning, immediately came back and got his family. He told them it was like April outside. It was 32 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah. So imagine it being so cold that 32 degrees is shorts weather.
Right. You're like, let's go to the beach.
It's amazing today. Oh my God. Yeah. Historian N.J. Dunham in the History of Gerald County, which is in South Dakota, says farmers took advantage of the pleasant weather to go to town or fetch hay from the prairie. All felt relief from the rigorous wintry weather that had preceded. In Gerald County at the time, there were 1,025 children of school age. And owing to the balmy conditions of the air, probably a greater percentage of those children went to school that day than on any other day in the weeks previous. From the Black Hills to the homesteads of Minnesota, a kind of like unofficial holiday feeling was around. From almost every house, someone went to town, either by foot or on horse, for supplies. Farmers turned animals out of barns to stretch their legs, drink at watering holes, eat some fresher hay. For the first time in weeks, people could be outside without being in pain. But not everyone was convinced, right? You get like people who feel the itch. A 40-degree rise in temperature in 24 hours didn't feel right to some of the more weather-wise farmers. One farmer kept his daughter home from school that day, even though she was crying and desperate to go see her friends. And he told a neighbor, "I feel there is something in the air."
Something's up.
Something's up. This shit ain't right. There was no National Weather Service at the time, but the Signal Office of the War Department had been repurposed after the Civil War to try and predict the weather and communicate predictions locally. One observer in New England was caught taking nude photos of young women in the observer station.
Jesus
One in the Rockies routinely fabricated a week's worth of predictions at a time and took them to the telegraph office with instructions to send one a day so he could spend the week fishing instead. And another hawked all the weather instruments to pay his poker debts and went to the pawn shop at the appropriate time every day to use the equipment to take the observations. So the men doing this job weren't the best at it. It's not science, you know. The science wasn't as developed as it is now. We barely understand the weather now. So imagine what it was like 140 years ago, right? There's no way, even if great scientists were doing really good data collection, there was no way to effectively communicate the results to most people. Like if you live on a 160-acre parcel, you're not close enough to the telegraph office for that message to get to you.
Yeah.
You go to town once every month, you know, like it just doesn't work that way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about how weather works. And my favorite thing about this book is you can tell by the other book he wrote that was specifically about American weather. I have never seen someone turn weather into like the driving force of a story before. Right. And I think that's one of the reasons I like this book is like he reports like pressure and temperature and wind direction and speed. Like those are the parts of a mystery that he's solving. Like he uses them to dramatic effect in a really great way. I've never seen anyone do it before. And a little bit I'm like, yeah, okay, but that's, I mean like verbally reading it is different. Maybe verbally saying, and then the pressure dropped to whatever. Like it just, you know, like being dramatic about barometric pressure isn't something I felt I could take on. So I don't really talk very much about the specifics of the weather, but for a little aside into how weather works, when air is still and cold over a cold landmass, the longer it stays still, the colder it gets. So in Canada, right around New Year, 1888, there was a high pressure node that was pinning down a large pool of cold air over very cold land. By Sunday, January 8th, the pool of cold air had pushed as far south as the Montana-North Dakota border. And, you know, we know now that the jet stream exists, right? And that the flow of air generally goes in a certain way, but they didn't really know that then. That pool of sub-zero air was half the size of a continent.
Jeez.
And then some unseasonably warm and humid air came up from Texas and the Gulf Coast. So you have an enormous pool of frigid air in one direction and warm, humid air in the other. And there is an enormous amount of potential energy in the temperature differential between those two air masses. And what turned it from potential energy to violent kinetic energy was a low pressure node that wandered between those two air masses beginning in the early hours of Wednesday, January 11th. We know that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So if a low pressure node moves between two air masses of contrasting temperatures, it's going to draw them together. They're both going to flow into that area. By mid-morning of Thursday, January 12th, the low pressure node had generated a head-on collision of the cold wind from the north and the warmer, humid wind from the south.
So this is the day after the warm day. Is that right?
No, Thursday, the morning was warm. Okay. The morning of January 12th was warm.
Oh, okay, got it.
The storm hits during the day, that day.
Got it.
Yeah. So basically, the people who are like, this is warm and balmy, they're on the edge of that warmer, humid air that's coming up, right? A little further away, it's still cold.
Right.
But it's much more dramatic to have it go from warm to whatever. Like, you wouldn't have experienced this blizzard. The blizzard happened at the line that those two air masses met at. Right? And so it wasn't a blizzard, it wasn't cold until they met, which is part of why this is magic. Those standing outside that morning said it looked like the northwest corner of the sky was suddenly filling and ripping open at the same time. Two boys out playing watched the storm roll in. We could see it coming across the lake, they said. It cut off the trees like it was a white roll coming in, and it hit with a 60-mile-an-hour wind. We were all out playing without scarves or mittens, said a Dakota schoolgirl. Suddenly we looked up and saw something rolling with a great fury at us from the northwest, making a loud noise. It looked like a string of big bales of cotton bound in heavy cords of silver. They were about 25 feet high, and the air above them was perfectly clear. These kids ran back to the schoolhouse in fear, and when the storm hit the schoolhouse a few moments later, it hit with such a force that it knocked it off its foundations.
Fuck.
Okay, so this is the story of Walter Allen. At another school in Groton, South Dakota, which was a small town, about 100 students were present. That's more than had been to school in weeks. They ranged in age from 4 to 14, and most had arrived in light clothes because of the unseasonable warmth of the morning. That was a key reason for the fatalities. People were celebrating the warm weather and weren't dressed for it, and it changed so suddenly, right? In the Groton school at about 10:30 a.m., the kids abruptly stopped chanting lessons and crowded in front of the windows to look at the sky. Moments later, windows and doors rattled as the wall of ice crystals slammed into the school. The teacher immediately called off school, and everyone prepared to go home to ride out the storm. And they felt safe doing this in Groton because it was close to town. Mm-hmm. At a lot of schools, like people who had experience of this kind of weather on the prairie, you stay where you are if you think you can ride it out. If you have enough fuel and a stove and you think the building is going to keep you warm enough, you stay where you are. You don't try and go out. But because this school was close to town, she was like, you guys can all get home. This just started. You know, we can do this. It's still daylight, whatever. As they walked out of the building, several teams of horses with drays hitched up. Drays are like old-timey flatbeds. It's basically just like a sled pulled behind horses. So these teams of horses with the drays crested the hill, and the children were loaded onto the drays to be taken to their houses. So like the town was like, oh my God, this weather, let's go get the kids from school. So like the volunteers came with their stuff, right? One of the students, who was 8-year-old Walter Allen, whose house was less than 40 yards from the school, hopped off the dray because he'd left something on his desk. And by the time he got back outside, he couldn't see them anymore. Like, that's how bad visibility was.
God.
Right? These are teams of horses pulling really heavy things. They're not galloping. They're fucking sledging. And he ran inside and ran back, and by the time he came out, he was lost. Right? Lots of accounts from that day say that the visibility was 0. Like, literally 0. If you held your hand directly in front of your face, you couldn't see it.
I can't even imagine that.
Nor can I. The air was so full of powdered ice crystals, and it was moving so fast that Walter had trouble taking a breath. You know that thing where if you stick your head out the window of a car and you try and breathe in, you can't because you have to like protect your nose? Yeah. He became disoriented and confused almost immediately. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. The air was so full. You're going to have to cut that out and go back. The air was so full of powdered ice crystals, and it was moving so fast that Walter had trouble taking a breath. Like, if you stick your head out a car window, you know, you can't inhale, you gotta, like, protect your nose. Instead of trying to shelter in the school, which apparently didn't occur to him as an option, and even though he was having trouble breathing, he decided to try and get home. His house was only 40 yards away. He became confused and disoriented almost immediately. He was crying, and the snow mixed with his tears until it formed a crust between the upper and lower lids. When he reached up to brush the crust away with the back of his hand, he scratched the hell out of his eyes, and soon the pain was so bad he thought it would be better to stop scraping the ice crust away. And soon after that, his eyes glued shut. Laskin says, once Walter's eyes were gone, the rest of his face went fast. A mask of ice covered the exposed skin of his face except for holes at the nostrils and mouth. Snow penetrated his clothing and froze into an armor of ice around his body. All of this happened in moments.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just, I've never experienced anything like it. I can't, I mean, we think we know what blizzards are, right? And maybe we do, but we also live on a power grid and we never have to worry about freezing to death. And we know that, like, you don't drive in the snow and maybe you walk or you get home if you can, but we also mostly live in towns. And these people basically live alone on a vast prairie, you know? Oh, God. Okay. Walter knew he was lost, and the next time he stumbled, he just laid down. Once he was down, everything was better. Less wind. The snow was softer. He curled up in the snow and surrendered. But when his parents and older brother saw he wasn't on the dray, They immediately went out to search for him. His brother Will slipped away from the rescue party and eventually figured out that visibility was a lot better close to the ground. So he got down on all fours, quote, under the storm, and eventually found Walter's unconscious body. He dragged Walter back up to his father's law office and then went to get his parents at home next door. And Walter survived intact.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. 8 years old. He lived in town, right? So Etta Shattuck was a 19-year-old teacher who had left her job a couple weeks before the storm and was headed out on the morning of Thursday, January 12th to collect her final payment so that she could travel back home. She wasn't far from the house where she boarded when the storm came, and she knew that if she followed the fence of the 40-acre pasture next door, that eventually it would take her back to the house. But for some reason, the cold, the wind, exhaustion, confusion, she climbed under the fence, and in 2 steps it disappeared. And she was lost. No landmarks, no sound except for the wind, in clothes not heavy enough for the weather. She groped blindly for a long while, and then suddenly there was a haystack in front of her. She dug into it with frozen hands and scooped out a hollow big enough for her body, but not for her legs. She pulled the straw over herself as best she could and started praying. By the morning, her legs were a block of ice, covered in snow. She wasn't found until 3 days later. Severe gangrene developed in both of her legs, and they had to be amputated above the knee. Yeah.
I think the thing that's so terrifying about this is it's taking what is familiar and comfortable and transforming it into something alien.
Right? We don't think of snow as a danger anymore.
Right. Or, I mean, even people in familiar environments. Like,
right.
You're safe. I know this walk. I know how to get there.
Uh-huh.
And she's even clever enough to go, all I have to do is follow the fence.
Yeah.
And then it's like, nope.
Yeah.
You're gonna die. You know?
In part of the book, he goes into what happens to you at various stages of hypothermia. And, like, in temperatures this cold, hypothermia is setting in within minutes. Just
right.
a tiny amount of time you're affected. And your mental faculties are kind of the first to go. Mm-hmm. Because when your body is under that kind of stress, basically everything retreats to instinct. All your blood retreats from your extremities, including your head. Like, you basically lose your shit almost immediately. You stop being able to think. And you see that in a lot of these stories. Like, they knew what they should do, and then as soon as they got out into it, they're like, fuck it, I'm just gonna wander, it'll be fine, They just lose themselves. I'm sure none of them said fuck it. These are all very pious, hardworking, religious people. I'm sorry. I said fuck it. So May Hunt, this is actually the coolest story, I think. Saddest, but coolest. So May Hunt was a school teacher who had 7 students that day. And she tried to teach well into the afternoon because she was like, well, the weather's not that bad and we have a lot of fuel and it's safer here than, out there, and maybe it'll blow over and, that sort of thing. But when the fuel for the stove ran out, she had to choose whether to freeze to death where they were or try to make it to a place where they could get warm again. So school teachers around this part of the world had to make that decision. Do I have enough fuel for us to survive here overnight? We don't have any food here. I mean, you're not going to starve to death in a day, but a group of 4-year-old kids at school, no food, really cold, like just terrible situations. And most of these school teachers, I think maybe all of them were, no, not all of them, because there was a story of a guy, but a lot of them were young women. Mm-hmm. Some of these school teachers were like 16 or 17 years old, right. Barely out of school themselves, right? And they're forced to make these kind of choices. So the closest house to May Hunt's school was 140 yards away on the other side of a gully. And she was like, okay, we have to try and get there and shelter there. So she had the students hold on to each other. And her oldest student, an 18-year-old boy, led the way. He stumbled near the gully and fell in, and his weight took everybody else in after him.
Oh, man.
And so now they're all in the gully. The snowdrifts are piled so deep that the youngest child was completely submerged, and they couldn't find her for a little bit. But eventually they all managed to get out, but they were now soaked to the skin, right? They tried to continue to the closest house. When they came upon a straw pile, they figured they were saved because it was a fuel pile that was close to the house they were trying to get to. So the oldest boy, whose name was Fred Weeks, and his younger brother dug out a shelter. They found a pitchfork nearby. Like, frozen hands can't dig through straw very well, but luckily there was a pitchfork right next to the pile. So they found a pitchfork. They dug out a shelter that was big enough for the teacher and the other 5 students, who were all younger and smaller than them. And everybody climbed into it, including the 2 older boys. And they started yelling. They're like, we are close to the house. They come out here every day to get fuel. It is not far. They yelled and screamed until they couldn't scream anymore, but they could not be heard above the wind.
Wow.
Yeah. So when they realized no one could hear them, the older boys volunteered to go out and try and find the house. The teacher had all the girls remove their aprons and tear them into strips to make a guide rope, which she gave to the boys.
Very smart.
Very smart. And they headed toward where they thought the house was. They worked in a spiral around the straw pile with their arms out in front of them so they wouldn't run into the house, but they couldn't find it. They followed the guide rope back to the straw pile and climbed in to wait it out. In the early morning, the storm had cleared enough that Fred could see the house they were trying to find. It was less than 15 yards away.
Oh my God, I'm just trying to imagine.
Yeah.
Circumstances that extreme.
Yeah. 15 yards away. He woke the family in the house and brought the group from the haystack to the house. 5 of the people who spent the night in the haystack were fine. Fred had some frostbite on his feet. He essentially put himself at the doorway of this hidey hole to protect everybody. And this book is full of that story. Like, if you're the oldest in the group, you're in charge and you sacrifice yourself for the youngest. And all of them did it without question. It was not even... Yeah, it was really quite beautiful. There's a story of 3 brothers and then neighboring families, 2 brothers who got separated from a group that was trying to find shelter. And the oldest brothers, like when the youngest ones got so cold they couldn't move anymore, the older ones literally picked them up and walked with them for as long as they could. But those 5 brothers eventually all died. The youngest ones died first because they were still on the back of their brothers, right? And then the older ones died a little bit after. They just couldn't move anymore. So Fred Weeks, who had laid at the opening of that shelter, had some frostbite on his feet after the night, but he healed and was eventually fine. But the youngest girl, the one who had fallen and was completely submerged in the snowdrifts, she spent the night with wet socks on and fabric tied really tightly around her feet because people didn't understand how bodies worked, right? So when they got her to the house, it was clear she had terrible frostbite on both feet. One of her feet had to be amputated completely, and the other had to have its toes cut off.
Oh.
Yeah. And she was, I think she was 4 years old. She was 4 years old, and she had to have her foot amputated. And she had to have her foot amputated in a time and place where, like, chloroform was used as an anesthetic, but did pioneer doctors have chloroform available? I mean, you know, how did that go down, right? Whew. Okay, so it was the turbulence kicked up by that low pressure node. This is a great quote from Laskin. It was the turbulence kicked up by the low pressure node that bewildered the people caught in the storm that day. But it was the high pressure that came after the low that killed them. Cold can kill, but wind and cold kill faster. Weather forecasters these days say that wind chill is what the weather feels like. Doesn't matter if the thermometer reads 25 degrees. If there's a 30-mile-an-hour wind, it feels like it's 8 degrees, and your body reacts as though it's 8 degrees. When most schools were let out that day, the wind chill was at 5 degrees. By 9 p.m., it was 40 below.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. 40 below is polar temperatures. And they're in, like, thin homespun clothes and no shoes, right?
And the weather tricked them into thinking it was fine. So they
party time. That's right. Yeah, they're in like sun frocks and shit. Yeah. In those conditions, exposed human flesh freezes in about 10 minutes. And many of the children trapped and lost that day had been outside by the time it was dark for 9 or 10 hours. Okay, so I'm going to read just a couple things from the book now. I mean, almost all of this has been from the book, obviously, but I'm going to just go directly to it here. Frank Bambus, a Czech farmer, uncovered the body of his wife, while shoveling a path from his farmhouse to his barn.
Jesus.
She had died between the farmhouse and the barn. She couldn't find either one of them. A Nebraska settler named Klaus Blake came upon a bobsled turned upside down and buried under a snowdrift. And when he pushed off the snow and righted the bobsled, he found the body of a little boy frozen underneath. In Turner County, south of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a farmer enlisted neighbors to help him search for his 4 children. Together, the men slowly walked the route the children took home from school. They spotted his 17-year-old daughter first. She was in a grove of saplings with her back to a tree. She had frozen to death, standing up. Her brother and 2 younger sisters were huddled at her feet. All 4 were dead. Peter Hines, in the same county, lost 3 boys. Crazed with grief, he was on his way to the schoolhouse, yelling that he was going to kill the teacher. But a neighbor whose children had survived stopped him and told him what happened. When the storm came up, the teacher begged the children to stay in school, and she even locked the door. But the children refused to obey. One of them was 17, and he led the rebellion. The kids overpowered the teacher and managed to get the door open, and then they fled home into the storm. Hines' 3 sons made it about 2 miles before they collapsed in a pasture, and they were all found dead.
Jeez.
John Jensen, a Danish immigrant, had gone out to his well to shovel snow when the storm hit around noon. He wandered lost for 7 hours before he eventually stumbled on a neighbor's house. The well is right outside the fucking house, and
they don't place those. They put those in convenient locations.
That's right. You're going to get water 3 times a day, you know? Between his well and his house, he got lost. 7 hours later, he stumbles to a neighbor's house. When he gets inside, the neighbors had to cut the clothes off his body. The snow was so tightly packed and frozen into the fabric. Though safe himself, Jensen was desperate with anxiety at leaving his young family alone in their farmhouse. His wife, Nicolene, who had never wanted to move to Dakota in the first place, their daughter, Alvida, and their month-old baby, Anna Nicolene. A week later, Jensen wrote in Danish to his sister, describing the tragedy that had befallen him. At 7 the next morning, I thought I would go home. When I came home, I found my wife outside the house, frozen to death. And then I went into the house, and there lay Alvida on the floor, frozen to death. From what I can see from the tracks, Nicolene had gone to the stable. She had many clothes on, but it didn't help. The little one, Anna Nicolene, was in the wagon, living. After discovering the bodies of his wife and daughter, Jensen walked 2 miles to his brother Andrew's house with the baby in his arms. When Andrew heard what happened, he asked, "What did you do, John?" "I cared for the living," was his reply. So estimates are that several thousand people spent the night on the prairie. They froze alone or with their parents or in a frantic pursuit of a loved one. They died with the frozen bloody skin torn from their faces. Some died within hours of getting lost. Some survived the night and died when they arose in the morning, as the cold blood from their limbs circulated to their hearts and stopped them. They were found standing waist-deep in drifts with their hands frozen to barbed wire fences. They were found clutching at straw piles, buried under overturned wagons, on their backs or face down in the snow with their arms outstretched, like they were trying to crawl. Laskin says, even in a region known for its radical meteorological changes, the blizzard of 1888 was unprecedented in its violence and suddenness. There was no atmospheric herald, no eerie green tinge to the sky. One moment it was mild, the sun was shining, and the next a frozen hell had broken loose. The air was so thick with fine-ground ice crystals that people couldn't breathe. The dust webbed in their eyelashes and sealed their eyes shut. It sifted into the loose weave of their coats, shirts, dresses, and underwear until their skin was packed in snow. Farmers who had walked the same paths for years became disoriented in seconds. It was traumatic enough that it left an indelible bruise on the consciousness of the region. Pioneers were mostly reserved and hardworking people who didn't put their thoughts down in writing, and when they did, they avoided hyperbole. But their accounts of the blizzard are shot through with amazement, awe, and disbelief. Even those who never wrote another word about themselves for the rest of their lives put down on paper everything they could remember about that day. And it's the storm that preserved those lives from oblivion. The blizzard literally froze a single day in time. It sent a clean, fine blade through the history of the prairie. It forced people to stop and look at their existences, the earth and the sky they staked their futures on, the climate and ecosystem they brought their children to, and the forces of nature and of God that determined whether they would live or die. The effects of disaster, no matter how extreme, don't last forever. We bury our dead, we tend to the wounded, we rebuild and get on with our lives. But the imagination and the identity of the region, the storm is etched as sharply as ever. This is a place where blizzards kill children on their way home from school.
Woo!
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. That's it.
Wow.
Ugh. Yeah. Ugh, man. Yeah, so, yeah, it moves me. It moved me a lot.
Do you know why?
So you and I are children of the 70s and early 80s. And I remember how my parents used to dress me up to go play in the snow in like heavy cotton clothing that immediately soaked through and became freezing and heavy and impossible. And I remember how tired I was just playing in the snow. And because I was reading the stories from like looking for the children's perspective, like, you know how hard it is to be in snow in the first place, and then the wind is blowing you over at 60 miles an hour. If you stumble, you're not going to get up. Like, that's it. And then once you're on the ground, he says in the book, basically, most of the people who were found lying on the ground. So like, once you're down there, that's kind of it. You're just now waiting to die. Partially it moves me because it's children, partially because in some way I think it's possible to read it as an act of vengeance from the gods of that land toward the people who had killed his people. Mm-hmm. You know? I feel like it's a terrible tragedy, and I feel for the children who died, and I am moved by those stories. And also, they were only there because they had murdered the people who were there before. So I think for all of those reasons, it's resonant for me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, I can't imagine, I hate being cold. I hate being cold. I will spend all of my money on like fucking NASA fabric clothes to keep myself warm when it is cold. And they were out there in basically like the towels in my kitchen were their clothes.
Right. And
they were out in this cold weather. And that is horrifying to me.
Yeah. I think the surprise of it is what strikes me. And obviously these are tough people who their livelihoods count on the weather. So they're connected to that. They're watching that. They're aware. They're educated on that as well as they can be. And just this freak thing can happen. Yeah. And take all of them by surprise is so crazy.
Yeah. And it was so sudden. Like, so a lot of the people who were on these properties were recent immigrants. Many of them had been there for, 3 years or less, and were barely surviving. It's a hard place to try and be a farmer. It's not farmland. I mean, it's very rich, but it's not farmland. Right. So, they were just hard scrabble. Like, we have to survive. The line between starving and surviving is incredibly thin. Everything, like every single thing is important and has to be done with care and attention or we'll die, right? And then this thing happens that they absolutely can't do anything about. And part of the reason I included that piece about the father who wouldn't let his daughter go to school, and that happened a lot that morning. A lot of people were like, nah, I don't think so. We'll stay around the house. We're going to stay around the house today. And I think those people are the ones potentially who were actually listening to the land and watching it and had developed some kind of relationship with it. or who had come from places with a climate similar enough that they knew how fast blizzards could come, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're from the Ukraine, you're from an area that's also removed from large ocean bodies. Because the Mediterranean isn't that big, the Black Sea's not that big, And so storms can come at you there in a similar way. Warm air from the south, cold air from the north, low pressure, boom, right? And so if you had that experience from where you came from, you might fare better. But, like the Danish immigrant, Denmark sticks out into the sea. It's completely regulated by the temperature of the water. And so he would have had no experience of what to do in a blizzard. Yeah. And there's also something heartbreaking, like depending on the perspective I'm empathizing with in the moment, like you come to a place because you want to try and build a life for yourself and your family, right? And the crossing was expensive and difficult, and so many people lost children and loved ones on the boats. And then they get here and they lose children and loved ones on the journey to the place. And then they farm for 3 years and it's almost impossible. Like they're very lucky to be alive. And then there's one beautiful morning, and then the children in their county are found frozen on the road in the morning, like just so hard. Wow. So hard. Okay, so this is David Laskin's book, The Children's Blizzard, from 2004. And it's really good. And he goes into a lot of the politics behind why the Weather Service didn't work and, things that I didn't find particularly interesting myself, but other people might. And he also, like I said, he does sort of a 10-page poem on the effects of hypothermia and how it affects you. That was kind of the most dark and beautiful thing I've read in quite some time. So I do recommend the book. It's much more than I've reported here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you for telling me that story. Wow.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it.
Well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for thank you for giving us a place to tell, like a place to tell these stories. Yeah.
Well, thank you. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Testing. Great. Thank you for listening to It Chooses You. Your hosts are Teresa Sparks and Claire Patton. Our theme song is by Bobby Dart. If you'd like to get in touch with us, drop us an email at itchoosesyoupodcast@gmail.com.